I'm Denise Defreese. I work for the East Bay Regional Park District, and for the last 12 years I like to tell my friends and family that I get paid to watch the grass grow. When they asked me to give this talk, it was going to be about tenant issues. We wanted to talk about the pros and cons, basically the tensions and successes of working with tenants. So I can say at the very beginning I was somewhat at the mercy of the tenants. I was relatively green. We had a vegetation manager. It was before David Ame, but at that time he took care of all of the parks. They were just in the process of switching it over to have the supervisors begin to take over the operation of the on-site things. So he was helpful, but I really had to kind of learn from the tenants. And right off the bat, they started teaching me things like, well, look, if you really want to have a successful utilization of this 2,000-acre pasture, you have to have cross fences. Because, you know, the cattle like to sit in certain areas, and you're not going to get the residual dry matter sampling that sampling results that you'd like to have. So I learned those kinds of things. I learned that the tenant taught me that on the west side of the ridge, the grasses are going to stay green longer because you have the fog and the influence of the Berkeley Bay things, as opposed to the east side of the ridge, which is going to stay dry. It's going to dry out earlier and be brown, and so you're obviously going to have different animal sets on each of those. Those are things that I learned from the tenant. And one of the things that I'd read was a paper that was written by some UC students in the late 90s. And they had done some documentation that included aerial and historical references in the East Bay Hills. And they determined that in the East Bay Hills, they only had 10% of the remaining grasslands left that they had from the late 1800s. And so from my position at Briones, you could look across to those hills at Tilden. And I know, looking at the paper, it tells you things like, of course, a big change in it would have been that massive eucalyptus planting that was up there. It would be the housing developments that were happening and the trees that are done, and the suppression of fire that stopped in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But the biggest effect seemed to have been when they pulled the cattle out of that area in the 60s. So between the 60s and the 90s, you could see that you completely lost all of the grasslands over there. As I'll talk about the experiences that I had with my tenants, one early on tenant we used to do rent reimbursement. He was a guy who liked to build ponds. He was a guy who taught me things like, well, if you want to have really good utilization, you're going to have your ponds up high, you're going to have them low, and you're going to have them scattered all throughout your field, and that's the way that you're going to get the best utilization. So first of all, that's a good knowledge if you're trying to manage your grassland. But secondly, from the park district's point of view, sometimes we need mitigation ponds. When we do parkland development, we have to do a bit of mitigation just like everybody else does out there. So here we had a chance to do a mitigation pond, get credit for a mitigation pond. We improved the stocking and the utilization of that land out there, and we were making additional habitat for the listed species that we had that included red-legged frog, western pond turtles, and other amphibians. Now, not every experience working with the ranching tenant was successful, shall we say. I would like to be able to tell you that we are like East Bay Mud, our sister park out at Briones, in which case they offer rent reduction if you can meet all of the goals that are in your grazing plan for that season. I think we're still working on that. But at this point, we don't do that. At this point, the grazing plan is agreed upon. It's put together by the vegetation manager. It's supposed to be implemented by the park supervisor. And pretty much you spend your time working with the tenant to see if you can meet the goals that you're agreeing upon. And they're also, of course, under the constriction of the grazing lease, which has all the rules and regulations that we like you to meet or not break. So in some cases, I've actually, there have been some really gross violations of the contract in those cases, and the tenant had to leave. And in very, very few cases, I've seen in the district that some chronic cases of failures to follow and meet the agreements and all that. And in those cases, those tenants are asked to leave. It's not something that we do lightly. But when that happens, something good comes out of it sometimes. As he was talking about in terms of requests for proposals, I was able to sit in on some requests for proposal meetings and interview some tenants, prospective tenants out there. And I can tell you that there's some really good people coming up. I can tell you that if you're a land manager and you're concerned because maybe you've had a tenant tell you nobody else is going to be able to do this like you say you want it to be done, you're never going to get another guy like this. Well, I would have to say that I disagree with them. Because maybe because we're obviously the East Bay Regional Park District, but I've had some people that were willing, or at least astute enough, to sit there and tell us that they want to manage the grasslands with natural resource management goals. We got a new tenant at Briones, a guy named Ed Wood. And first thing that I wanted to do, I told you I was working on the Yellow Star Thistle projects. So we sat down and we're putting together the grazing plan for the season. And he was a guy that I could sit there and I would say, well, I want to end up in this field at this time of the year for a season. And I want us to go through these. And I had this idea of how I'd like us to just quickly go through. So we worked together. He would sit there and he would tell me, well, I think it's going to take this amount of animals. And I want us to go from this field to make it be the simplest and least cost producing in terms of labor to get the animals where we want them. And you know what? We did it. We met every goal that we had set for out there. And that included reduction of invasive weeds. It included the promotion of some perennial grasses that I knew that we had out there. I found a whole field of Bromus carinatus on something that I'd never seen before. I was pretty darn excited by the end of the season. But what I really liked was he was a guy, he was a new guy, and he wanted to talk regularly, and he has one of those little Blackberries, so he could send me texts or phone calls or whatever. So we talked regularly, and he enjoyed talking about the management of that land as much as I did, which was really inspiring to me. But not only that, since he was out there on the land all of the time, he was the guy who first noticed that we had Medusa head in the middle of a pasture in the back of the park. That was the first report of Medusa head that we had in the park. So from that, we were able to work together. We contacted the integrated pest manager, and we got permission right away for him to go out and do a liberal herbicide application. So I'm happy to say that we still have yellow star thistle and milk thistle, and we're still fighting some other battles. But we don't have Medusa head at Briones. So he was just a perfect example of a guy that I learned to recognize is you can form a real alliance. And in fact, we should be forming a real alliance with these guys. They know their animals, what they can do and what they do, and we can just set up the plans and work cooperatively together for something like this. I just have come to realize that these guys, they love this land. They know this land way better than we do, and they're managing it just as well as we are in many cases, as we may want. And in fact, they have the same goal. They want a productive grassland. They want these types of things just like we do. Sometimes when I'm working with our different tenants, oftentimes we're asking them to do goals that we would like. But sometimes the tenant needs a little help from us. Like, for example, our sheep person who is extremely cooperative, works a piece of land, moves the animals around wherever they like. We have ungrazed, we have grazed, we have this whole mosaic section out in one area. And when I came on, he said, could you think you could work it out so that I only have one person to report to? Because, obviously with the researchers and the different folks that are out there, it was getting a little confusing as to sort of who is in charge. So in that case, I say, yeah, absolutely, I'd be happy to step in. And I think as I read grazing plans and things like that, I think that there should be some recognition that there should be these conversations with the tenants, previous tenants, or the families or whatever, because of that knowledge base, and an incorporation of that knowledge base into any grazing plans that we are planning to set up. Like I said, when I talk with a guy about, say, a Medusa head problem out in a land, they already are noticing it. They can tell me when it came in. They can tell me where they see it worse and what effects their animals seem to be having on it, and what they've heard. You know, that's one of the things. What do you guys are, I know, just like park people, all these ranching guys, they're all talking with each other. So, you know, what's the guy up north doing about it or whatever? So just learning and taking some of that knowledge base and incorporating it into the management plan is the best thing to do, I think.